Take a person, take a story, take you on a journey. It's your take.
My guest today is a professional musician who has performed and recorded with some of the finest bands and artists. He was born in New York, and his music education involved studying songwriting at NYU with Paul Simon between 1969 and 1970. During his early years, he was composing music for theatre productions at Music College, writing 2 pop operas, performing on stage, and early tours with the National Lampoon Travelling Roadshow, the Rock Revue and Shindig 77. As a keyboard player, my guest has worked with the crème de la crème in the business. He was Bryan Adams' keyboardist from 1981 to 1998 and performed on the Reckless, Waking Up the Neighbours albums. Featured on the Clash albums Combat Rock and Sound System, toured with Dire Straits on the Love Over Gold tour and is on the Alchemy album and concert film. He's also worked with Ian Hunter and Mick Ronson from David Bowie's band, Bon Jovi, Nils Lofgren, Todd Rundgren, John Waite, the B-52s, Cyndi Lauper, The Pretenders, Bo Diddley, and the blues guitarist Otis Rush. On today's Your Take, I'm joined by Tommy Mandel. We discuss Tommy's childhood, education and love of music, his early musical endeavors, life on the road, and working with music royalty. A very warm welcome, Tommy Mandel.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you kindly for joining me on Your Take. I say this evening, or shall I say this afternoon. Tommy, there's lots and lots to discuss, but I thought before we speak about your love of music and your long musical career, can we go back and rewind to the very beginning? And I wanted to start by asking that you were born and raised in New York City. Can I ask what year you were born and which part of Manhattan you lived in?
Okay, well, I was born in right about a few blocks away from where I live now. First place I lived was the Ansonia on the Upper West Side, which is sort of Broadway in the 70s and 80s. So now I still live, I moved back there. When I was a year and a half, I have a twin sister, so sometimes I say I, sometimes I say we. So when we were a year and a half, we moved up to the suburbs, about 25 miles north. And I went to all my schools up to college. At the university, I went up in the suburbs. And then as soon as my sister and I got into college, my parents sold the house there and moved back to the city. So then I was up in the state of Maine at college, and in my junior year, my third year of college is when I worked with Paul Simon. I took an exchange program at NYU, so I was there for a year. So that's the 1969-70. So I was born in 49, so by then I was probably about 19 or 20, something like that. And we had piano lessons for 6 years, starting when we were 6. My sister thinks we started when we were 7, but I think we started when we were 6. And for 10 years, I had to practice a half an hour a day. I think I had one day off a week, and one other day was the lesson. And that really made a huge difference.
I want to pick up specifically on childhood, but particularly growing up in a vast and cosmopolitan city. What was that like from the perspective of a very small boy?
Well, again, I was only in the city till I was a year and a half old. Then I grew up in a place like when we recorded at Wessex Studio, which was outside of London. You know, it's more like grassy and stuff, and not the intense concentration. So I would come to New York City to visit my grandmother's, and I remember the first time my grandmother let me go out by myself in New York City. She practically had a heart attack, oh, what did I do? What if he doesn't come back? I had to go 2 blocks to the Woolworths and get something. It was fun. But it wasn't like I know people that grew up in the city, and my daughters spent a few years in the city before they moved out. My take is that people that are brought up in the city are a little more high strung. Their nervous system functions at a slightly more rapid pace than people that are we're not really laconic. And I wasn't far from didn't grow up in a rural area by any means. It was suburban, so there was cars everywhere. You could walk somewhere or you could ride your bike. But when I finally moved back to New York City, I think I was about 18, 19, 20, 21. And I've pretty much been there ever since. But if I said I grew up in the city, I would be misleading in a way. I had a girlfriend that grew up in the city, and she's a wonderful person, but she's on another level entirely.
Tommy, I wanted to talk about your memories of your parents and ask you what they did for a living. And did you come from a musical family? And what kind of music was being played in the family household?
It's a funny question, because when people used to ask my sister and I that, we'd say, well, our mother, when they were running away from the Nazis in the 40s, in the late 30s and 40s, she ended up in Portugal with her parents, and she sang on the radio. So she was a good singer, and her father used to sing at gatherings, and she could play some piano. And my father, I'll play you how he would play piano. He'd go like this. That was his piano style. He loved music. He loved big bands and jazz, and they were party people, my dad and mom. They used to party and get dressed up and go out and drink and dance and have a really good time. And he worked in the textile industry that his father had started from scraps, from collecting scraps off the ground in early 1900s, and bought his own push cart eventually, and then got storefront and built it up really big, to the point where they'd go to Europe and buy for France and Belgium and buy lace and embroidery and come back and sell it to dressmakers. And then my grandmother took it over. And that's the other thing I want to say about the music. Both of my grandmothers played piano, and my mom's mom used to just go like, she'd play this, she'd either go do like musical chairs, or else she'd do this other piece. She could play that for hours, and she was good. And then my other grandmother, who lived to be 105, my dad's mom, I never knew she played piano unless she had a little one in her house that we ended up, and she made sure that I got the family baby grand in the end. She could tell, and she did me a solid, because it was in some of my relatives' houses, but she said, well, it had to move. She said it should go to Tommy. So thanks, Grandma Becky. Anyway, so one day she just sits down and plays Those Were the Days, my friend, from that Mary Hopkins song.
Yeah, of course I know, yeah.
She's like, that's a song from the old country, So she could play too, yeah. So both my grandmothers played. My mother sang and played a little piano, and my dad had the one finger thing going on. And my sister ended up following her musical studies further than I did, and got a graduate degree in music education, and taught elementary school music, basically 6 to 12-year-olds at the public schools. You'd call it, public schools mean something different in England, I guess, but the one that everyone goes to for like 33 years. So she's a musician too. So we do have it in our family to a certain degree, but it's not like they were professional musicians, any of that.
Music was very much in the blood, and you've already mentioned about learning the piano from a very young age. You started taking piano lessons from around about the age of 6 and played for around about 10 years. But what are your recollections of your tutorage over that period?
It was interesting, because piano teachers tend to be eccentric people, so do piano tuners for some reason. So every once in a while we'd get a dud, someone that just wasn't happening. And if my sister and I both complained to our parents for 6 months, they'd get us a new piano teacher. They'd get us a different piano teacher, which really helped, because I think a lot of piano students get stuck up with a teacher that's just not into it, or not good, or has personal problems, and they just stop. So the fact that I had my sister and I, we were both saying it, I guess our parents took it more seriously, and they were willing to, make changes to the teachers. We ended up with we worked with this guy named Harry Davis. He had a school, so we didn't always study with him. We hardly ever did. Only his star students did. But he sent us a teacher, and we, had a few different teachers from the Harry Davis school up there. And I think my sister ended up studying with him, but I don't think I ever did more than once. So, although David Spinoza, I think a very famous guitar player from my hometown, he actually worked with Harry Davis too at some point, and he was on Dr. John records. Paul McCartney produced John Lennon. He's on John Lennon record. Produced James Taylor's Walkman from my hometown. David Spinoza, he's like one of my hero guys. And I did one session with him later, and I saw him at Max's Kansas City once. Like, I think he was going out with Yoko then. I didn't know it. I didn't know he went out with her until just a few years ago. I read it. But so he was there, and I was there playing with someone, and he said, I didn't know you played, because like I was supposed to be a scientist, this nice Jewish boy growing up in a musician. Are you kidding? And so the fact that I ended up being a musician was a bit of a surprise to everybody. But they went with my dad, and me made a deal. He was like, well, I'll give you till you. I said, let me do this till I'm 30. And if I don't get anywhere by the time I'm 30, then I'll get out. I had my college degree. I almost didn't finish college, but I went to see Traffic and I had imbibed some substances, and I had a vision that these guys, Steve Winwood, these guys are so much better than me that I think I should get my degree just in case, this is a bit of a pipe dream, me being a musician, So I went back and bit the bullet and did another half a year at college and got out early because I had some AP advanced credits from high school. And but I don't even know where my degree is. I did go up there for the 50th reunion in June, and I played in the chapel. I was like this kind of celebrity up there. It's really strange because at the time, like there were a couple of people I had that were friends, but most of them were these like jocks, athletic guys from poorer backgrounds, and they looked down their nose at me. You from New York, you think you know everything, And now we were all friends, I got a little bit of respect, and I respected them a lot more than I did then too. About 50 years, I guess you learn something.
From the age of 16, you started playing in various bands.
That was because when they let me stop taking lessons, I hadn't practiced for the last year. From when I was 15 to 16, I was still taking lessons, and the teacher was worth looking at. I do remember that, but I wouldn't practice. And she was trying to teach me jazz. I didn't really like jazz. And so finally they let me quit. But for my 16th birthday, my dad got me this little kind of organ thing, like one of these kind of things. Wait, not like this. One of the box. It wasn't even a box. It was a cheaper one. And I loved it. And so then I started playing in bands. And then instead of music being a chore, which I loved but didn't realize it became an obsession, and we were doing Beatles songs, we were doing James Brown stuff, R&B, because one of the guys in the band was a really good R&B singer and guitar player. He taught us chords and stuff. It was a good band. And so starting about 16, I was in band starting when I was 12, but we were reading stuff out of books. It was like a different kind of thing. It was Dixieland, So, but starting around 16, I was in bands and really enjoying it, but it was totally thought of as a hobby. But getting that organ was a big deal because I had been looking before, and what was available then was just these huge things that had electrified stuff in it, but you couldn't move it to a gig or anything, which happened later when I finally traded up organ to a box organ, and then I traded that in and got a Hammond. I sold it and bought a Hammond that had been in a fire. That you couldn't move that either. You needed the truck, So the guitar player in our band would always have friends with a pickup truck so we could take it to gigs. But that was incredible sounds, like the Rascals or Stevie Winwood or Procol Harum. It's great.
When you were playing in your teens, mainly playing on the East Coast scene, what was the music scene like at that time, and what kind of music were you playing? You said mainly covers material.
Yeah,
but what
covers? Yeah. Well, I had a summer job at a beach club, and I had to like go and sweep the cabanas out and collect the diapers that people put in the towels, and there was the guy that was a year ahead of me. He was a bass player. He was playing in a band called the All Six at a club, and they played pretty much nights. And he said, take my advice, kid, don't be a musician. But it was just, you play at somebody in the band would get a gig that knows someone. You play at a church, in a church basement at a dance, and you'd rehearse once or twice a week in someone's basement or garage. That's where the word garage band came from. And yeah, well, when we started off doing cover tunes, after the part where we would read like jazz standards from books, there was like trumpet players and trombone players, and everyone had the same book for their instrument from the same series, and we'd just play it. That was different. So when we started doing bands ourselves, somebody played drums, somebody played bass. Usually it was a guitar player who they had another guitar player. Oh, okay, I'll play bass because the first 4 strings are the same. And then if there was somebody like me that had piano lessons, hopefully, and if they got a keyboard, if you didn't have a keyboard, you try to make it work. You know, you play where there were pianos, but otherwise you just bring it to the rehearsal and then bring it to the gig, set it up, put the legs on it, and you'd play like a couple of Beatles songs. And I got in a band senior year of high school when I was like 16 or 17. There was this really good band, and a lot of them had graduated, so I got to be the drummer. My friend Billy got me in the band as the keyboard player. I had to learn all the Stones songs, and I only knew the hits, but I learned a whole lot of Stone songs for that band. So that was good. The Crispy Critters, it was called. And the leader of that band, Tor, his brother had just graduated, and Tor went on to be a ship's captain. He had his own ship, and he'd like just drive people all, sail people all over, like the Caribbean and to the West Coast and stuff. That was his career. He's a cool guy.
Can we talk about your music education in the late 1960s and early 1970s? And can you also share your memories of studying songwriting at NYU in the same class as Paul Simon?
We'd had the 10 years of lessons, and it was divided between pop, classical, and theory. Theory is a big part of music where you learn how the different notes go together. It's sort of the math of music, but it's really fun. And it's a big part of music, and it makes everything so much easier. It makes it so you can play a song in any key, say a song in this key, and the singer comes there and they say, wow, it's a little bit low. I can't sing it in that key. Well, if you know theory, you could just, okay, I could play it in this other, I'll play it in a higher key so you can sing it better. And it's really important for singers to sing within their range, so unless they're so amazing like Aretha Franklin that they have or Bjork, they have a huge range. But so by the time I got to NYU and auditioned for Paul Simon's songwriting class, I already had a pretty good musical background. And at college, my first 2 years at the college I went to in Maine, the regular liberal arts college, I took music. The first year I took a course in orchestration I signed up for. So the first assignment, write a string quartet, a short string quartet. So I went home, I got the paper and the music paper and the pencil and wrote out something, and I brought it to class the next day. I'm like, okay, let's hear it. And it's like, well, we don't have a string quartet here, we can't really hear it. But so I said, okay, well, forget it. So I switched to electronic music. The same guy taught, and then we had these 2 tape recorders, and I had my organ up there. I brought it up on a truck or something. And so I made all these crazy electronic tapes with echoes and go from one tape to another tape recorder and got into the electronic aspect, but I never really learned orchestration until later. But then when synthesizers came out, you could just set something up to just sound like strings and guitar. You could do it on a keyboard. So then I kind of learned some of the tricks myself. But if I had really studied orchestration more, it would have been good, because orchestration, you learn what not to write. Like if the strings are doing this, then the piano can stay out of that range and do something else, and that's something you learn when you orchestrate and where different instruments sound best. But anyway, so and then I took a theory course at the college also, but the teacher gave me a sort of offhanded compliment. He said, you're one of the best people that's been in this class in recent years. We had to write some stuff, and I wrote some stuff like Bach and stuff like that. It was stuff I had written earlier when I was, so it was good. By the time I got to Paul Simon's class, there were auditions. There was like a rumor, oh, Paul Simon's going to teach a course here. And I just happened to be at NYU for that 1 year, my 3rd year of college. And so there were auditions. So I went to the audition, And so I played a song like everyone else for him, you know, just everyone went in one person at a time. And he said to me after, he said, well, there's nobody else that can play piano, so you can be in the class. It wasn't like, oh, that's a good song, or, you know, it was like, we need a piano player, so you're in the class. So 7 guys got in out of about 70 or something. And it was a good experience. It's hard to teach being for Paul Simon to teach, you know, how to be Paul Simon, you know. It's really hard when you think about it, because how do you think of Paul Simon? Like, what would you say is his essence?
He's an incredible songwriter. I'd say a very underrated guitar player as well, but so prolific. Simon and Garfunkel as a duo with those harmonies and that Everly Brothers influence.
Yeah, and he had just broken up Simon and Garfunkel, so maybe he was looking for some new inspiration. So we did it for a year, 1 day a week, and there were some other good people in the class. The Roaches were in the class, the Roach sisters, but they weren't at NYU, I don't think, but he found them in a bar and he said, you know, you guys are good. You should come on Tuesday nights and be in the class. So, and Melissa Manchester, she was a singer. And then there were these 2 good guys that I never heard from again until recently. One was Joe Linus. Now I'm in touch with him. He lives out in Northern California. He's still writing stuff. He's really good. A friend of mine, E.T., produces him now. But a lot of them, and one guy ended up writing a lot of stuff for Disney, but most of them, you know, of our 7 or 8 people, I don't know what happened to him. And Paul was very fastidious. Like, he'd examine everything. Like, you bring something in and he'd take it apart, like a kid, like dissecting a spider or something with your song. It's kind of painful, but you know, that he was a very analytic person. And he had this theory about the sound of the melody and the sound of the words, and the sense of the melody the actual melody, the shape of the melody actually told a story, and the words had to somehow fit that story. I still don't really remember it, but it was a very interesting concept.
Tommy, I want to move.
He was a good guy. I saw him a few times after that, and his lawyer offered me a management deal at one point, and I ran into him at Lincoln Center. He was playing a scrub board, you know, at a ballerina kind of thing. He's an amazing guy. Yeah.
Tommy, I wanted to move on to the beginnings of your musical career. How did you manage to receive representation from the William Morris Agency and then go on to sign for Epic Records? And then secondary to that, I wanted to ask about you going on to write 2 pop operas that you wrote, Joe's Opera and Sea of Semele. What were they about? Where were they performed, and what was the audience and critical reaction?
Well, it all was very zigzag. One thing led to another, led to another. Okay, so it took 2 tracks. First of all, the summer after I did graduate college, well, I graduated college in January, and I moved upstate with a band, and we grew beards, and some guys had motorcycles, and my parents came up to visit, and they were horrified. We're living in this house where, don't walk on that stair, it might fall down, you know. And the money they spent on college and all the work, it was like, seemed like I had just thrown it all out the door, but it's not like I had. But so that summer, we were playing upstate, me and my friend Steve and Brian, who just passed away, and Johnny Sarlo, the singer, in our band. And actually, it's only some of us. So we were playing with this guy, John Simpson, who went on to form Sound Exchange. But he was a good songwriter. He was from our area of the suburbs. And he had a gig up in Albany. And I got a call from a friend of Steve's, Tom Gould. And he said, my friend Laura Svetke got a call from her friend Joyce Lindorf that Sarah Lawrence College is looking for someone to play piano there 1 day a week for a theater class. And so it was a friend of a friend of a friend told me about it. So I said, well, I'll try out, you know. You didn't say, that's the secret. Say yes to everything, because you never know where anything will lead. So I went and met this guy, the professor, and he fell in love with me because I was a cute guy and he was gay. And he was super talented. And the other person that was up for the job was a girl from Juilliard. And I knew the Carole King songs and I could jam. And she was like, oh, I have to read it. And so I got the job and she didn't, because she could play so much better than me in so many ways. She could read better than me. But for that particular job, they needed someone that could flow, and get along with the teacher. And so I started doing that job, and I learned how to be a really good accompanist over the years. And so then that's one leg of it. And he was connected with La Mama Theater down in the East Village because he was very creative and super talented and very, very confrontational. He would always try to find the space inside of you that you weren't comfortable with and make you work there to get something real out of you instead of just hackneyed. He hated hackneyed, he hated anything that you don't phone it in, So he'd find something that you weren't comfortable with and just push on it until something interesting came out. But anyway, so he wrote a musical that we did up at the school, and we used songs from Nilsson Schmilsson, 5 songs from Nilsson Schmilsson, Lime in the Coconut, Without You, and so then the show got picked up to be done down in the Village. And they couldn't use Nilsson's music. And I was a musical director up there because I was working the class and we had a good rapport. And I kind of, I'm good. And he knew I was good. And I didn't know what to think of him, but I was learning tons of stuff from him. And so he said, you got to write some songs. So him and the playwright wrote lyrics, and I put them to music. So we did that downtown. And it got picked up by someone else for off-Broadway, from off-Broadway to off-Broadway. And that's when William Morris decided to rep me. It got a good review in the paper. They mentioned my music. And so all of a sudden I had an agent at William Morris, and I was 22. And so then I was like, I went to see Oh Lucky Man. I don't know if you remember, it's a movie with Malcolm McDowell.
Yeah, it's a tremendous film. Yeah, Lindsay Anderson film.
Yeah, so I saw that and I'm like, wait a minute, that's just this guy going through this adventure and that adventure, just one after another. It's like a series of vignettes. I could do that with my songs, So I made up a story and put them together okay, before that, rewind just half a year, because your life works along a few different channels. So when I was at Max's Kansas City, when I ran into David Spinoza, this guy from Epic Records, who an incredibly gifted photographer, and he was the A&R man at Epic. Stephen Paley saw me there playing with another band. See, take any path. It was a band that I was just like playing keyboards, and they liked me. So they said, do a couple of your songs. And Max is Kansas City, So I sang a couple of my songs. Stephen Paley didn't particularly wasn't interested in the band, but he thought I had some talent. So he got me signed to Epic Records, introduced me to Clive Davis. And he said, okay, so it was a development deal. It wasn't a full-fledged record contract. It was like, all right, we'll pay you a salary every week for a year. We promise to put you in our studio 4 times and pay for sessions. And at the end of the year, we'll either execute this standard record contract or else you're free to go. And they took me to lawyer. I signed a regular contract, but it was a development deal. So that only went into effect if they exercised their option, which in the end they didn't. And they gave me back the songs. They didn't keep the songs, which was good because I took those songs and Lindsay Anderson style, put them in a show and called it Joe's Opera, gave it to my boss at Sarah Lawrence, and he directed it. And we did it as sort of like a puppet show at the Mama Theater, and it was amazing. I got my friend Johnny Sarlo in it, and these 2 girls, Lisa Kirshner and Camille Tabaldio, and it was amazing. There was like, this is Joe, and it was Joe's Opera. John named it, John Braswell named it, my boss at Sarah Lawrence. It was based around an upright piano, and we all had whiteface on because he was a big fan of whiteface. I guess he liked Bob Fosse and Lindsay Flower, different people like that. And so I was playing the piano, but I was also acting in it. And there were little props, like at night when the mother put Joe to bed, I'd have to go like this, and they'd put a little doll there. And somehow John made it look like it was my head on a body, and then this lurk would come, this nightmare guy, that turned out to be my salvation, but I turned my back on him because he wanted to rob a bank. And then we squirt the bank teller with a squirt gun, but it's full of acid, and I go to jail, and then Lurk is in jail, and then Lurk comes in. It's like Peter Pan sort of, but Dracula. And so Lurk comes back for my daughter. I get out of jail, goes through straight and narrow, marry Annabelle, and then so then Lurk comes. We did it like 3 years ago at Sarah Lawrence. I got another production, all girl production, except for one guy. Well, I guess, you know, with genders now, it's really hard to really classify things anymore. But so we did it a few years ago, but and William Morris, they didn't quite know what to do with that. But then it got next year we did it at another theater, an off-Broadway theater, had some bigger people in it that went on to do big things. And then it was optioned for Broadway twice, Joe's Opera, and they never raised the money. And I think it was partly due to the fact that I really didn't grow up in a theater environment, you know, from many different points of view. And it was more of a rock kind of opera. And it was a little early. I mean, it wasn't Hair and it wasn't Godspell. So there were rock operas out then. And I know Stephen Schwartz, and he knows me. And it may not have been as good as the really cream of the crop, or it may have just been too strange. And everyone said, oh, the book, you know, we love the music, but the book isn't so good. So then I wrote another one, trying to learn from my mistakes, called See a Simile. And we did that at Sarah Lawrence. And the idea was to bring it to the city, but it never made it to the city after that. And I eventually turned it into a cartoon. I recorded it at home in my studio here with really good singers, Jimmy Tunnell and Dee Carstensen and Gregory Fleeman and Alison England and Camille Tabaldio again. And then I was taking it around in science fiction. So that one takes place underwater. It's if I try to explain it to you, you will lose the audience. You know, you'll think I'm crazy, but you're getting that look on your face already. But so then I made a cartoon out of it, and you can see that on my WordPress site, but it's hard to watch. I don't really know enough about, I know some stuff about Photoshop, but when it comes to animating it, I used a lot of Ken Burns type things. This was in the 90s. It was Premiere when it was Premiere version 4, really old. And it's kind of cool that one guy could do it. And I think there may be, it looks good on a phone screen, you know, so there still may be a time for my cartoon, but I think that still works better listening to it like a radio play. But that one's complete because I have a really good recording of it that I like. Joe's Opera, I'm still not satisfied with. There are 3 or 4 different recordings of it, but none of them really capture it. And then I rewrite it, you know, and it seems, oh, I got this. I really made this part better. And then I listened to the old 1974 version. I'm like, wow, that is so simple and so direct. You know, that's really what I wanted to say.
From writing to rock operas, I wanted to now come on to how the opportunity came about to tour the US and Canada with the National Lampoon traveling roadshow, and also touring West Berlin with the Rock Revue, and also with Shindig 77.
Good questions, man. So Shindig 77 came about because I was in a band called the Miamis. When I was at NYU, I met this guy, Jimmy Winbrand, and he had brother Tommy Winbrand. And Jimmy was at NYU, so he auditioned for Paul's class, right? Paul Simon's class, and got in with the song that Tommy had written. So I got to be friends with Jimmy at NYU. And Jimmy and Tommy had this band called the Miamis, and they would play at Max's Kansas City and CBGB's, places like that. And so I started playing with them on piano, a place called Broadway Charlie's, and we were killer. And Debbie, we would open up for Blondie or do double bills with Blondie and the Ramones, and we were friends with all those guys, you know, Jimmy and Tommy more than me, but Jimmy and Tommy started working with this guy, Anthony Ingrassia, later on, 77, after the Live at CBGB's record. And Anthony had this connection with Berlin. And he had we did the show down in the Village. And Anthony got it done in Berlin, too, at this big Academy cultural festival there. So we were there for a month in 78, but we did it in 77 down in Soho, in Tribeca. It was a show. It was all 60 songs. So that was cover tunes too. That wasn't the Miami's had great songs like We Fucked the Boss's Wife and We Need a Bigger Navy and Wang It and Let There Be Pain. There were a million great songs that the Miami's had. And the We Deliver was on the Live at CBGB's record because Jimmy and Tommy were really good songwriters, but worked. You know, they're sort of like a little like Weird Al, you know, but punk Weird Al back in the 70s. And it wasn't like they were parodying other songs, but they were funny, you know. But they were also kind of they rocked. They could really rock. They were from Miami and Chicago. They had moved around a bunch. so we ended up in Berlin doing that. And then I went back to play with a blues band because I met a couple, I was there for a month. I met some people, you know, and I got invited back. That wasn't a big deal, but it was fun. I love going to Germany because I speak a little German because my mom and her mom used to talk on the phone every day for about an hour in German when I was growing up. So I heard a lot of that, but I studied French in school. But now we go to France on tour, I can understand. No, actually, I speak, you know, and I can speak and they start talking back at me in French. And I'm like, whoa, slow down, you know. But in German, I kind of can pick it up a little more. It's weird, but I haven't been on the road for a long time. Going on the road with Bryan Adams for so many years was great because I got to practice my languages a little bit. We skipped one part of it. I forget what part we skipped, but going from being a composer to being a sideman. Yeah, that just sort of happened. Otis Rush, by the way, didn't like me. I had 2 gigs to do with him, and the first night we played down in the Village, and I got a call from one of his people the next day. Mr. Rush doesn't want to come back down at night, so I must have been a little not supportive enough, a little too showy. I don't know what it was, but so he shouldn't really be on my resume. But Bo Diddley was amazing. He even came over here to my place and recorded a couple of songs, you know, and we traveled, we did some of my favorite gigs were with him. Jimmy Satin was his music director who lived in my building. Other people, I got in the National Lampoon thing also from a guy in my building, Paul Jacobs. He was like Leon Russell in National Lampoon Lemmings down in the Village. And so he was like their musical director guy for National Lampoon. And they had a tour coming up and he wanted to stay in town because he was working with Meatloaf or something. Maybe before Meatloaf, but he did a Meatloaf album too, Paul Jacobs, and Roy Buchanan, Edgar Winter. He lives upstairs. So he said, do you want to do this gig? And I said, sure. That's the best word to know in this business, sure. Say yes. Don't say no to anything. Unless somebody's trying to get, you know, violating your space. But even a little, you know, you have to put up with just a little of that, but don't do anything that doesn't feel right, for sure. So Paul got me on that gig. And then, so after the National Lampoon thing, which was 3 months of traveling around, and then Germany, I was back in New York and my father got very ill and passed away. But right around then, how did that happen? Oh yeah, okay, so I'm playing at Movie Klingman's studio with my band, songs that I wrote, trying to get a deal after Epic. This was 76, and some of the people from my old band were Johnny Sarlo, the singer, and other were new people. Larry Russell on bass, Mike Epstein on drums, Ricky Shutter on drums. Anyway, so we're working at Moogie Klingman's studio. He's from Great Neck. He co-wrote You Gotta Have Friends, and he played with Todd Rundgren from Eastern Great Neck. Very talented guy. He passed away recently too, Moogie Klingman, but he was great. And he had the studio. And he heard me play, so he knew I could play. And he said, hey, can you sub for me tomorrow? I'm supposed to play the open call auditions for Hair tomorrow, or the callbacks for Hair, and I can't do it. So I said, okay. So I went up to this Broadway theater, and I sat down at the piano, and the actors would come in and say, put their song in front of me, and I'd play it. And if they had a lot of music, and it was hard, and it didn't have chords, they did not get the gig, because I couldn't play it. You know, so I screwed up some people's chances. I'm sorry. But at the end, for some reason, the casting agent said, I want to put you with this singer who needs a regular, steady pianist to go around with. I think you'd work well together. So Franny Pillersdorf, the casting agent, put me with Ellen Foley, who had just done the Meatloaf record, and she had a deal as a result of that on the same record label, Cleveland International, which was part of Epic, part of Columbia, same management. And so I started going to auditions, being her pianist. So when she went in up to the mic, I went over the piano, and the regular, whoever had been hired to do the audition would go sit on the side, and I'd play her song for her. And then she got the deal. So Ian Hunter and Mick Ronson, who were producing it, came in, because they were also managed by Cleveland International, Sam Letterman, same people, and Steve Popovich. New York City.
Yeah.
New York City sound. Siren.
Fire engines going.
Yeah. And it's turning into an old neighborhood. So, well, people just don't die anymore, you know. So there's a lot of ambulance sounds too. So Ian and Mick came to check out her band. And I was about this far away from Hilly Michaels' cymbal. He was the drummer. He had 2 solo albums on Warner Brothers. First one produced by Roy Thomas Baker, Hilly Michaels, and he was in Sparks. and Dan Hartman, really great drummer, musician. And he played on my first EP for free. He just played he just give me anyway. And I paid him back hopefully later on by, helping him out too. But he's a great drummer. But I had put a lot of paper in my ear because I didn't want to go deaf, And so I was probably playing louder than I normally played. But that, I think, impressed Ian and Mick. So they're like, you can be on Ellen's record, And so me and Hilly were on her record. And then at the end of that, it was a great record. It came out, it's called Night Out, and we recorded it. And I think Bob Clearmountain mixed it, which eventually got me into a Bryan Adams situation. And Ian and Mick were like, we'd work on her record and I'd be playing a string synthesizer or something like, wait, let me get a more of a string sound. And it would be, they'd be going, night out, night. And so Mick was there, who's amazing. He plays violin, amazing string arranger. He did a lot of David Bowie's arrangements, like probably, Is There Life on Mars? He probably did that. And so I'd be holding this note and Mick would go, so I go to that note, and then he'd go that way for the next chord, and I go down to that note. So he was like directing, the direction, but I got to play it, so it was fun. And so then we're doing a tour to support You're Never Alone with a Schizophrenic, which is an Ian album I didn't play on. He used most of Springsteen's band on that. But so it was a 5-month tour, and I met my best friend Tom Morgel. Well, I'd met him before, but actually, so we had a great time on the road. And then that led to other things. But then I was on the road. So by then, and what the biggest thing, that all the girls that came to the shows like, man, Van Halen was here last week and they were amazing. They partied so much, So we were like sort of following in Van Halen's footsteps, or like it was like if you go somewhere after there's been a hurricane there, it's like what was left of Van Halen's, tour. So it was fun. And then Mick used me on David Johansen's record because he was co-producing that with Dan Hartman at Dan's house up in Connecticut, which is the state sort of, if you go from New York City to where I grew up, the same in north for that much further, you get to Dan Hartman's house, and he had a studio in his house. So then I started playing with David Johansen, and he had another keyboard player named Ronnie Guy. So we both played on it, and we did some gigs. And then eventually I was in David's band, and then played with Sylvain from the New York Dolls. And I started working at Power Station a lot. And so then I get a call. It was 1984. No, it was 1981. And oh, okay. So another thing should I keep talking? Are we still going in the right direction, or you want to ask another question?
I'll tell you what, I'll go to the next question, because you mentioned Bryan Adams' name, and it kind of leads on nicely to my next question, because you recorded and performed with Bryan Adams from around about 1981 to 1998. What was it like performing with Bryan professionally for many years and in different capacities? And what did you learn from him? And what are your memorable memories from being in that band?
Okay, what I learned from him is you have to be completely focused on your goal. If you want to get to anything in the music business, you can't just say, well, I'm going to let things happen. I don't think everything was about accomplishing what it was that he set out to do. And I think that the only people that make it in the music business are people that are like that. But he managed to combine that with being a super fun guy who loves music and was very happy to take his friends along with him to everywhere, Great Barrier Reef, scuba diving, safari in Africa, flying over Masada in Israel. He just liked having his friends around. And so he got this bunch of guys that he picked us out one by one. He knew who he wanted, and he just waited till we were available, so in 1981, I had started working a lot at one studio and fell in love with the studio manager because she offered me recording time, and she was really cute and smart. And so we started going out, and then I didn't want to lose her. So before I made a move on her, I signed her up as I signed up as she was my manager. And so we're sitting on my bed and the phone rings and it's Bob Clearmountain. It's like, hey, Tommy, this new kid is getting ready to make a record and he asked me to produce it. And I heard some of the stuff you've done on Ian's records and stuff. And maybe Ellen Foley he was thinking of too, I have a feeling, because he may have mixed that, or if Harvey Goldberg didn't. They worked on it together, I think. And so I said, well, when's the rehearsal? And he said, such and such a date. I said, oh man, I wish I could do it, but I'm doing a Sylvain session. I can't. And so he said, oh, too bad. I'm about to hang up. And that was Bryan Adams he was talking about. And so Jean, my future ex-wife, grabs the phone and says, wait, can you change the rehearsal? And so he did. And that's when I met Bryan and everything clicked. But if she hadn't grabbed the phone and been one of those type A kind of people, I don't know what would have happened in my life. I probably would have made it, but maybe not.
We'll move from Bryan Adams to another A-list and hugely successful band, Dire Straits, and you spent a year working with them from around 1982 to 1983. What was it like working as a sideman with Dire Straits and collaborating with fellow keyboard player Alan Clark? And what did you learn working under Mark Knopfler's musical direction and your recollections of being part of the Love Over Gold tour and the Alchemy album and the filmed concerts at the Hammersmith Odeon?
Well, what I learned from Mark was to stay in my place. You know, it was a big operation. There were maybe 50 or 60 people involved. And it was any tour that's really well done is a little bit like an army. You know, everyone has their rank and their function. And it works well if everyone knows what it is and the lines of communication are good and the chain of command is good. And so Alan was like my corporal or lieutenant or sergeant or whatever it was. And I was like basically there to play the parts that they had put on, mostly on Love Over Gold, that were too many parts for Alan to do all at once, because with multi-tracking and overdubbing, Alan may have put a piano on something, a two-handed piano and an organ and maybe a synth too. So Mark and Alan got together with management, I guess Ed Bicknell before that, and they decided, well, we're going to have to get a second keyboard player for this tour. And they may have asked Guy Fletcher first. I don't know. I heard a rumor that they had asked him, who ended up being the keyboard player after me, second keyboard player. But I think he was out with Brian Ferry at the time. And so they asked Bob Clearmountain and Neil Dorfsman, especially, who had produced, who had engineered and maybe co-produced, I don't know, the Local Hero album that Mark did with Alan. Alan did tons of great keyboard work on that. And so they said, who's good? Who's in New York? So they mentioned me. So I went in to meet Mark at Power Station. I admired one of his guitars and he said, play something. So I went and played this thing that I had written for Joe's Opera. So and so Mark goes, hey Alan, come over here and listen to this bougie Tommy's playing. So he liked it, so I had the gig. So we went out to dinner, me and my future ex-wife, manager, and Mark and his partner, and it was great. We clicked, and so next thing I knew, I was going to England. I signed some papers, and I was going to England, and we rehearsed for about a month in a really cold place in Wood Wharf. In London, near the Cutty Sark, and there was a lot of tea and a lot of vegetarian food. Alan was a vegetarian, even back then Alan was. And then we went and did a bunch of gigs in England. And I think it was just England then, a bunch of gigs in England, and it was great. It was great. It was a huge operation. The pre-production was pretty demanding. I had to play very specific parts. And not only that, but think of Sultans of Swing. There's no keyboards on it. The first, I don't know if they put hardly any keyboards on until their third album, you know, even Communique, I don't know it that well, but it's just a 4-piece, and that's what was Dire Straits' charm. Meanwhile, now there's 6, 7 guys, 2 keyboard players, and maybe a sax, a guy playing some percussion, and the idea is be able to do the newer stuff. The third album, you know, the one with Romeo and Drew.
Making movies is the third
Yeah,
one, yeah.
So that was Roy Bittan playing a lot of keyboards from Springsteen's band, and Alan learned all those parts, and he's amazing. He could actually fool you, play piano with one hand and organ with one hand. You think it's two guys. You know, Alan's like incredibly gifted. He's a great guy. He's one of my favorite people, and he's one of my heroes too. And it was great because I got to play with him this year for 3 weeks on the road. And he's 40 years better than he was back then. So Alan's really a very special guy. He's doing a lot of solo stuff too. He said that's his favorite thing to do now is his solo piano work. He also does a lot of work for Trevor Horn now, as does Phil Palmer, the other guy, one of the other guys that was in this Dire Straits Legacy thing we did last summer. So Alan would tell me what to do, and Mark would tell me what not to do, and so we got to the shows, and there'd be like something swing. I'd have to wait 5-6 minutes before I could play anything. And I'm standing up there. There's a light on me, you know. So I start bouncing around, you know. And so after the first night, the guys looked at me and they say, "Wow, you were really moving around a lot out there." I said, "Well, I don't know what else to do. You know, I don't want to just stand there, you know." And so the bass player, John Ilsley, great guy, said, "Well, I kind of liked it, you know, so keep doing it." And so then John started moving around more in house. So I got kind of everyone moving around more in the group, I think, because I never really seen them before, but it turned into a thing. And Peter we played in the spring for the Prince's Trust, you know, and Peter Townsend was the presenter, and he came up afterwards and he said, "You know, you're moving around, kind of put me off a little bit," but my wife quite liked it, you know. So now I when I look back, I you know, would move less, but you know what's worse, John Waite. I see some tapes with him. We played 84 and 85, and I'm bouncing around like a gay jumping bean. It's really, I don't know. It doesn't look as cool as it felt at the time. But that was a great band. Had Earl Slick and Carmine Rojas from Bowie's band. You know, Earl Slick ended up playing with John Lennon too, and Carmine Rojas went on to play with Joe Bonamassa and Rod Stewart, and me and Alan Childs and John. And John was completely free. He was the opposite of Mark Knopfler. Play what you want, you know, and it was great. I was doing some great keyboard stuff in that group, and they gave me a solo so they could go up and catch their breath. And that was 84. And 85, I went out with John Waite again, but everyone else in the band was different. We had Frankie LaRocca on drums, great guy, who played some with Bryan too. And I knew from David Johansen, because he was from Staten Island like David. He had been in David's band. And then he was an A&R man, Frankie. Frankie LaRocca was this incredibly cool guy. And Joe Vasta was on bass, and John McCurry, a very guitar player who played with Billy Joel and Julian Lennon was the guitar player, great guitar player. So that was 84, 85. But so the Dire Straits thing, I had to just not play a lot. That was kind of the restraint. But when I did, it had to be very specific. And I kind of made up the string part on Romeo and Juliet that became part of the record. You know, I didn't expect, you know, writing credit for that. It was just an arrangement, you know, but it was a little like what I did on Bryan Adams' Lonely Nights. It was like, wait. That's the Bryan Adams part. So the Romeo and Juliet part was. So you can see the melodic similarity.
Do you know what? The interesting thing is, whilst you were playing that, I could see the actual Alchemy concert film, because I think they filmed two young actors stood outside the Hammersmith Odeon,
Yes.
caressing, and then you see Mark wearing that kind of red jacket, and then with the
bandana, the sweatband,
the bandana, and then obviously playing that resonator guitar, and it brings back some very fond memories. We moved from your collaborations with Dire Straits.
Before, I shouldn't say this, but they picked that moment to not show the musicians, so I think that was Mark saying something. I would thought of it that way.
I want to move on from Dire Straits to solo pursuits, and You released several solo albums, including your self-titled album in 1981. Can you talk about your solo work, and do you enjoy composing and recording your own music?
Yeah, it's funny because I think the first song I wrote was 1968. It was called "Support Your Local Police." So I had always been writing songs, and then I was in a real good band called Fluid. I told you some stories about them in 67, 68, 69. Steve Love, Brian Madey, and Johnny Sarlo, and we wrote original songs for that, and we recorded the record plant. Didn't get a deal, and then Steve got in Stories, and he was in. And then Luther Vandross, he took off before the rest of us. He's very gifted guitar player and keyboard player and bass player and writer. And Brian got Steve in Stories. Brian got in Stories and then they had a #1 record. And Johnny Sarlo went on to do other things, but he acted. I got him in Joe's Opera. He was a star, and he's just still one of my best friends. So we were writing back then. That was the 60s, right? And I kept writing this. And then, when I was signed to Epic, it was as a singer-songwriter. So I was writing then 71, 72. And I kept writing. And in 73, 74, when I was in Moogie's studio, we were doing my songs. So, but I never could quite get a deal. And maybe, well, it wasn't only because I wasn't the greatest singer, because we had other singers singing. Johnny was singing some. And, but I ended up sticking them in my rock opera or something. And then synthesizers came out of it, clavinets and Fender Rhodes and Hammond first. And I kind of managed to get one of each of those. And so and they had a 4-track tape recorder, that was about this big. It was heavy, but everyone had one of those. So I could record my own stuff and still couldn't get it released though. So then when I met my future ex-wife and she offered me recording time, it was another version of not getting my own stuff released because we put it out ourselves, that Tommy Mandel EP of 4 songs. That was stuff I did at home on a 4-track. Then I'd bring the 4-track down to the studio in her car usually, and would bounce it up to a multi-track, and Wayne Vulcan, who owned the studio that Gene was the studio manager of, would record. Hilly Michaels come and play drums. I'd maybe sing it again. I'd add some other instruments. Maybe Zenobia would come and sing some backup vocals or some lead vocals. Zenobia, really talented singer. She was in Hair, Zenobia, and you could find her. She sang on a lot of my stuff, and we're like sort of soul brother and sister, sort of. She lives out in New Mexico. She still performs, but she was in Hair and stuff, Godspell. So we'd be transferring the stuff. And then at some point we had some really good recordings. Mark Rivera from Foreigner and Billy Joel on sax, Tom Marangelo from Carlos Alomar and Jimmy Destri on guitar, and Ian Hunter's band, and Hilly on drums, and Eric Parker on drums on one tune, Bob Medici from John Cale's band, and Tile Face's sax player. And so we just, well, what would it cost to put this out? And Gene goes like, well, I know this guy that'll do the artwork for it. And my friend will do the artwork. Nina Lido from Scoop Productions did the art, the photos. And that photo that I'm pointing at the camera, that's Nina took that photo, Nina Lido. And Nina Herman was her name back then, but I think that was her married name. She went back to Nina, L-E-T-O. Really cool, talented person. They worked at Tomato Records together, Gene, my ex, my manager, and Nina. And so we put it out. I was like, oh, $1,700, we can get some printed up. Gene romanced this guy at Important Records, Jim Kozlowski, and they distributed it. So I had a record out, finally, after all these years of writing songs since like 68, this was 81. And if something finally came out, not like that, but it made me fall in love with Gene. So we got married. In 84, I had 2 great daughters, and then she dumped me, but it took a while. I was on the road a long time. So guys, if you go on the road, or girls, be careful. It's treacherous. Even if you don't cheat, it's very hard on a marriage, because the person at home feels like they're doing all the work and suffering, and you're suffering in your hotel room, having a nice time a couple hours a day, and sending the money home and being faithful. It doesn't matter. You come back with two different realities, you know. And anyway, and I bought a house, and well, the house is still there, but it's not my house now. But I've got this. Look, I can play anything. I can play this fake Telecaster. 1450. Or I can even go into this thing and play them both at this. I could play everything at the same time. Am I still on camera? I don't know if you can see me from here. Let's see. Okay, so 1. Oh, that's too fast. 1, 2. This is my metronome. Hang on. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hear that?
Yeah, I can hear it. Yeah, the beat.
Okay, here comes the snare. That's a different synth. I'm gonna go to a different one and do a hi-hat. Okay, now maybe it needs a bass. I don't know what I'm gonna do, but let's do that nice pad sound first. This is gonna be atmospheric, I guess. I don't know about that. We change the sound on that. Yeah, that's better. It won't get in the way as much. Pretty good, huh? So you could do them all at once, one at a time. It's like having 6 Alan Clarks in the room at the same time.
I was in my element there. You had me boogie on down there for a minute or two. Yeah, I was enjoying that.
We'll name this one after you.
Thanks a million, Tommy. Tommy, I wanted to ask you, you've worked with a who's who of A-list musicians, and there's been countless, most of which we've discussed in our conversation this evening. Ian Hunter, Mick Ronson, Dire Straits, Bryan Adams, Todd Rundgren, John Waite, Richie Sambora, Paul Butterfield, many more.
Yeah.
Which musicians have you most enjoyed working with, and why?
Well, my answer used to be David Johansen was my favorite, because the smile never left his face, and he just has such a sense of style and humor. And the music had a lot of high energy. He was just a really slick guy, David Johansen. Buster Poindexter, whatever. He's just really slick guy. Richie Sambora was also super nice and very musical. One night we're in Japan or something, and we're getting ready to do the show. Chasm Sultan's a bass player from Todd Rundgren, who's from Staten Island. I know him from Tom Marangelo. I played on his solo record actually in 1981. Him and Tommy Price, the drummer from Joan Jett and Billy Idol, they did a duo record, Sultan Price or Price Sultan or something, and I played the keyboards on it. It's in 1981 or something. But anyway, so Chasm was with Todd forever, but he also was doing this Richie Sambora tour. I think he's the one that got me on it. He reminded, because I played on a Bon Jovi record. I was the flavor du jour for a while. In 1986, I was just, anyone who came through town, oh, we need a keyboard player. Well, get Mandel, he's pretty good, So there were other guys that were working at least as much or more. Some other good guys, Jeff Bova, Rob Sabino. Rob Sabino was at the power. He played on Chic, on those Chic records. He's a great piano player. I once said, are you going to get this new expensive synthesizer? Mark Knopfler had bought a Synclavier, which was like an $85,000 thing at the time, with options, plus options. And I said to Rob, I didn't know him well, but I said, you going to get one? He said, no, man, I'd rather have a house. So he's working for a church now, but he's on Good Times. That's him on piano. He's really good, cool. And Jeff Bova did a lot of stuff. Michael McDonald. So there were other keyboard players that were getting kind of cool, or jingles. That was another thing I did, some jingles. And that actually was good for my musician's pension. I get a small check every month. And a lot of it has to do with, some of it's the Ellen Foley record, because Martin Briley did the union contracts for that, and he did it by the book. So we got a lot for that record. You know, we got union scale, and not very many people paid union scale back in those days. I think Ian did too, though, and Mick. I just got lost.
Tommy, I got one final question, and then after that we move on to the final quickfire questions that we will ask all your take guests exactly the same questions.
Okay.
But finally, outside of your music endeavors, what are your interests and hobbies? And have you ever considered working in a creative area outside of music? And then lastly, you mentioned your two daughters. How do they look back at your career, and are they musicians like yourself?
I got interested in like Photoshop and in art, you know, and just drawing, doodling. So when I made Sea of Simile into a cartoon, you can find that on tommymandel.wordpress.com. There's a link, one of the tabs that says my rock cartoon or something. So that's a hobby, and I still do a lot of art on my phone. There's this app called Blow Draw, and I do tons of pictures on that. Other than being a grandfather and being a parenting was a big love. And now I have 3 granddaughters too, and that's fun. A couple days a week. I don't think I could do it full time, but it's really rewarding. And I do teach at a college. It's sort of accompanying theater class. The same gig I got with John Braswell back that led to everything. I did that from 71 to 77. And then I went on the road. Paul Jacobs got me the road gig. And then with the Lampoon. And then in 2000, I got that job back. My friend Shirley's like, hey, you want your old job back? I'm chairman of the theater department now, and we need somebody. The keyboard player that's been doing it since you, Jed Disler, fantastic pianist and composer. He doesn't want to do it anymore with no benefits, you know. Yeah, I was off the road for 2 years. I had worked pretty much with Bryan Adams 81 through 88 on the records, and then some recordings after that, but more, that's when I joined his live band. So 88 to 98, we did all the touring. And then I had to get home and sort out the divorce and be around my family a little more. And things were, you know, winding down for the moment for Bryan. It was good for change for everybody. But just this year, you know, we worked together on just last year we worked together on something else. It was nice. And I do talk to him from time to time. And I talked to Mickey and Keith and Dave, all the other guys from Bryan's band I'm still in touch with. And so that was a question that so other hobbies. I would say just graphics, and I wrote my memoirs, but I'm not putting them out. Just playing music, synthesizers. I love sounds. I love different sounds. And I have like a collection here that's somewhere between a museum and a hoarder and a network, because like you saw, everything is connected. I could just sit over here and just play all the different keyboards just from the one keyboard, and then I could bounce what we just did over to this computer, and it comes out like this. So I'm still doing a lot of synthesizer instrumentals, and I put them up on SoundCloud, Tommy Mandel. If you search SoundCloud for Tommy Mandel, but there's also a link to that on the WordPress thing. Other than the graphics and the music, sports, I used to wrestle in high school, but I certainly don't wrestle now. And I walk around the city a lot. I'm crazy about coffee. I got a pretty good coffee machine. I make my friends lattes and cappuccinos and stuff, and espressos. Those are my main hobbies, I would say.
Tommy, we move over to that time where we ask all our guests the same quickfire questions to establish things we maybe haven't found out about them during the course of the interview. Don't need to think about these in any great depth, but here we go, Tommy Mandel. Question number 1. What would you say is your favorite pastime?
My favorite pastime leaving sex out of it for now, I would say playing the piano in the dark.
We move on to films. What would you say is your favorite film and why?
It used to be Performance with Mick Jagger. Then it was Johnny Mnemonic with Keanu Reeves and Henry Rollins, because of that speech that Henry Rollins makes about the new epidemic, the new AIDS being information overload. And then there's a few other ones I could watch a million times, but I can't think of them right now. Life is Beautiful is one of them.
We move from cinema now to novels. But Tommy, who would you say is your favorite novelist?
It's been William Gibson, but late William Gibson, the guy that invented cyberpunk. He had he's the guy that sort of came up, at least as far as I know, came up with the idea of people jacking into the internet and stealing other people's data. And he's still writing. And I think there's something coming out. He wrote a book called Agency a few years ago, and I think it's been made into a movie, but it may have a different name. William Gibson. Another one is Neil Stephenson. Especially, I like these guys' first three books best usually. William Gibson's new ones are good too, but Neil Stephenson wrote some amazing books, Snow Crash and The Diamond Age. I'm rereading Charles Stross's Accelerando, which is kind of out there, but I don't know if I'm gonna get through it. And my latest is Woody Allen's short stories. He writes really fun short stories, especially if you're a New Yorker. It's really a great taste. There are I like Dostoevsky too. I did finally read a Thomas Hardy book, which was good, and I think I read Great Expectations last year by your countryman Charles Dickens, and that was good too. Yeah.
Tommy, if you could have chosen a different...
and Susie Roach writes really good books. Suzzy. She's one of the Roach sisters. She's got two books, and they're amazing. One's called wait, I got them right over here. Wayward Saints by Susie Roche. Suzy, I think she pronounces it. And another one is Max Barry, an Australian guy. Max, sometimes he got two X's, sometimes just one X, Barry. He's really fun. Max Barry. Jennifer Government's a good one. Okay, sorry.
Tommy, if you could have chosen a different profession outside of music, what would it have been?
Shoe salesman. No, let me think. I guess a teacher. It's hard. Teaching is so hard. I couldn't be a piano teacher. I don't have the patience. But I did, a friend of mine, Kwame Johnson, was working for Youth Theater Interactions, which was like a group of a nonprofit that brings culture to the ghetto. And a couple of years ago, he said, we want you to do a series of piano lessons aimed at 8-year-olds that have never played piano before. So I got into it, and I put the piano over on a mic stand, the mic on the phone camera on a mic stand over the piano, and I put some tapes on the keys, and I taught from scratch, and to the point where they could play Fly Me to the Moon and Lean on Me pretty much. And I don't know if anyone's taken it, but that was hard work, and that was just by myself.
Next, who in life would you say has been your greatest inspiration?
Willie Mays and Steve Winwood, and they're both Tauruses.
We go from inspirations now to newspapers. Do you read a newspaper? If so, which one?
Well, not really. I'd say if we had to say a newspaper, it would be the New York Times again, although I got really anti them when they came out for Hillary instead of Bernie. But that was a few years ago. What I do is I go to YouTube, and they serve me up different stuff depending on what I've previously watched. And I like Reuters, and I like BBC, and I still do the New York Times crossword and get some games on it, and I'll check the New York Times. And then there's this guy named Beau of the Fifth Estate, Beau of the Fifth Estate. He's a Southern guy, but he's a liberal, and he's really good. He's former military, and he's trying to talk the language of the South to people in the South and get them to start thinking a little differently about things, you know. And he tries to be fair, so I like him. And there's this other guy, Peter Zeihan, Ziehan, that I got really into for a while. He's got this geopolitical idea of what's Russia's move and what's going to happen. But I'm starting to think that he's completely wrong. So I probably shouldn't have mentioned it.
We move from newspapers to food. What would you say is your favorite food?
I make this soup. I make it almost 3 times a week. I get a can of Progresso lentil and or the Annie's organic lentil, and I put it in a pan. Then I put some red horseradish in there, which has the beets, and some cayenne, not too much, and some turmeric, curry powder, which has turmeric, garlic salt, some goat cheese, and mix it all up. And then I'll slice in some banana or apple and stir it up, and it's really good. And that's kind of my favorite thing to eat these. I like salads too. I'll eat a good salad any day. I don't eat much meat. I do like salmon. I made sometimes I'll put sardine. I like sardines lately too, the kind that come in the can with olive oil, but with salt, not with no salt added. But they could be iffy. But I've been having good luck with sardines lately, and they're cheap. And apples. I think my favorite food is apples overall.
Next, we ask our guests to choose their favorite cultural icon. It could be a figure from history. It could be someone who's maybe changed the world with an invention, or maybe a political leader. Who would you cite as your favorite cultural icon?
John Coltrane, because he was musical and he was spiritual, and he was a minority, and he just didn't let anything stop him. He just followed his muse.
From John Coltrane, the jazz man, now to favorite curse word. What is your favorite curse word and why?
Bollocks. Just because it sounds so cool.
And one more time.
No, it's okay. I don't want to swear in public.
A man who's traveled the world, obviously performing live and with all your musical endeavors. But what would you say is your favorite place or holiday destination?
Oh, I had one. I'd say tied between New Zealand, Auckland, New Zealand, and Italy somewhere. A lot of different places in Italy.
The question you never want to ask a musician, particularly when they have so many influences and have worked with many, many people, which we've established during the course of this conversation. But who's your all-time favorite music artist? And what would you cite as your favorite album?
Okay. Can they be 2 different people? Does it have to be the same artist by the
No,
okay,
go for it.
I would say Traffic's second album called Traffic, but it's totally tied with a bunch of other, but you just want one, right?
Yeah, one's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm just gonna say Bjork, early Bjork, just for the fun of it.
Interesting choice. What would you say, Tommy Mandel?
No, let's switch that to Thomas Dolby. He's really great. I met him. He was on the Twisting by the Pool video. He was there with the video director hanging out. And I said, man, I really like that song Airwaves. He was happy that I knew it.
What would you say, Tommy Mandel, is your greatest achievement to date?
The kids.
And then finally, the last question. How do you wish to be remembered?
Not an asshole.
That is a great short answer.
Oh, thank you. It may not be true, but that's my wish anyway. Yeah.
Tommy Mandel, thank you kindly for firstly for being a guest on your take and telling us about your incredible music career, all the people you've worked with, your solo pursuits, your early education, your days in the theatre, composing opera, composing various types and styles of music, and also for your great enthusiasm and through the course of the interview, giving us snippets of music, and your enthusiasm has shone through the whole interview. And thank you kindly for sharing it this evening.
Thanks, James. And I just want to thank one person that I haven't mentioned yet, Gary from Invisible City, because he found me and he puts out vinyl with my stuff on it. So I'm very grateful to Gary and Invisible City Editions for that. So, and
Tommy.
thank you, James. Thank you so much. It was really enjoyable. Thank you.
Tom-
As the lights go out around me, I will just wave you and your fans and your audience a fond adieu.
And then lastly, Tommy, how do we find out more about you, listen to your music, maybe even see you on the road?
Well, if you go to tommymandel.wordpress.com, there's everything is there. There's a tab that says current gigs, engagements, what I'm doing up, like the local gigs. I'm going to be up in Boston with Dennis Leary, the comedian, and also at the Michael J. Fox Parkinson's benefit in New York with Dennis Leary. Those are my two sort of people that people might know. I'm also playing with Lavinia Draper at on the 30th at Prohibition. She's a really talented cabaret singer and crazy person. And that's all on tommymandel.wordpress.com. But also there's links to Spotify of all my CDs that I put out by myself in the 90s on CD Baby, and the cartoon rock opera, and 360 Facebook Live. If you have Facebook, there's 360 different times that I just turn the thing on me playing piano like I used to do at the Empire Diner. And if you have Facebook, you can just click on the link on that one page and it'll take you to and there's a set list of each one too. So tommymandel.wordpress.com. And I'm going to put an interviews page stuff there too. I'll put this one on there if you like, if you tell me how.
Thank you kindly. And lastly, Tommy, just to let you know, we have a good musical ident, an intro and an outro, which is done by a great musician friend of mine. But if you could come up with a keyboard or synthesizer outro, maybe for your take, and this is kind of putting you on the spot, would you close us out with one?
How long would you like it to be?
Say 20 seconds.
Okay. Let's see. Well, we get. Nah, you already heard that. Okay, we did that already. Okay, I'll play some piano. I think, you can still see me, but this is good. You see, yeah, okay. Here we go. It's the Joe's Opera, beginning of Joe's Opera. Thank you, James. Can we fade this out, or do I have to stop it?
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. That was brilliant. Oh, I really appreciate that. I hit start.